Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night from wherever you're joining us. We have a large audience and people are still checking in, but my name is Horst Simon. I'm the director of Idea Lab, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our second lecture in our best paper competition. The presentation today is about building probabilistic causal models using collective intelligence. The presenters will be Olav, Laudy, Alexander Denev, and Alan Ginsberg from Causality Link. And I'm welcoming the speakers to get started, and we will go for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll go into the question and answer session, and I will chair the Q&A session. I'll ask our reviewers to use the raise hand button, and I will call reviewers first. And secondly, I will call the general audience. Currently, it says here on my screen, we have 41 people attending, so it's a great audience. And I wanted to remind the reviewers that you should have received a scoring sheet, an Excel spreadsheet, so please use it to record your marks. And it's probably best to do it while the impression of the paper and the presentation are fresh. And so I don't want to spend more time and turn over to Olav and Alexander and Alan. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for the kind introduction. I would like also to thank Dia for organizing this causality competition and for selecting us as one of the final paper in this competition. What we'll be talking about today is how to build probabilistic graphical models by using collective intelligence. I will be using the words Bayesian nets, Bayesian networks, and probabilistic causal model interchangeably. Of course, there can be many approaches to do probabilistic causal modeling, but in the presentation today, I'll be referring to Bayesian nets. Olav, you can switch to the next slide. We drew inspiration from three books when we started this research. Of course, at the center, we have the Book of Why of Judea Pearl. Of course, this is a follow-up from his previous book on causality. He's one of the pioneers of Bayesian networks and causality. To the left, we have a book by Riccardo Rebonato and Alexander Denev, which applies Bayesian network for scenario analysis and stress testing in the financial domain. And this book is also a follow-up from a previous book by Riccardo Rebonato called Coherent Stress Testing. And to the right, we have another quite inspirational book by James Surowiecki, Wisdom of the Crowds. It's a very nice book, and it shows also in empirical settings that sometimes having a crowd of non-experts can outperform fewer and better informed experts. So this is our inspiration. And the agenda for today, I'll do a brief introduction to Bayesian nets as causal inference engines for scenario analysis. Many people on the call are familiar with Bayesian networks, I'm sure. That they have different applications. We saw in the first presentation application to networks. Of course, you can apply them to time series analysis, but I'll be focusing today on scenario analysis. This is why I'll give a brief introduction of how we can apply them to scenario analysis. So what are the challenges with building Bayesian nets and how we can solve some of the challenges by using public domain information, collective intelligence. We'll briefly discuss the natural language processing engine, how to build the directed acyclic graph, how to populate the tables with conditional probabilities, and hence how to come with correct forecasts. We also will show a trading strategy based on these Bayesian nets. So why Bayesian nets? Of course, they have a lot of desirable features. I show to the right a table, and this also in the Book of Pearl. Of course, they have some features that they make them really desirable when it comes to modeling changing systems. They're robust because they can help us modeling underlying causal mechanisms that do not change in time, unlike correlations, which are very unstable. They're very good when it comes to responding to changes because they're graphical structures, and they have different variables, different relationships, and it's easy to see where to operate surgically if needed to perform a change. They're good to extrapolate the past because they can source different data sets, and of course they can also incorporate forward-looking expert information. And they're modular. Whenever we need to do a modification, we don't have to reshuffle the whole graph. Unlike some other probabilistic graphical models, like undirected models, they're fairly modular, and we can operate very locally if we want to perform a change. So they're very powerful too when it comes to expressing causal relationship and also telling causal story. And when it comes to finance and investing, of course, there are a lot of economists around. They publish their narratives. They already reason in causal terms. If this happens, this will happen. If this other thing happens, then this will follow. So already the thinking in finance when it comes to scenario analysis is in causal terms. They've been employed in different domains very successfully, life sciences, engineering, but also now they're seeing a light in finance with different challenges compared to these other domains. I'll give an example. What means to apply Bayesian nets to scenario analysis. Again, this started off from Ricardo Rebonato's book, Coherent Stress Testing, back 2010. At the time, we were during the great financial crisis, and previous modeling in finance had been done based on correlation measures like the correlation metrics. And it's a classical approach. If you want to measure, for example, the risk of your portfolio, you calculate the correlation between different assets. You do your nice Monte Carlo simulation in the future, thousands of different paths. You select a quanta of in the distribution according to a level of risk appetite, but it relies purely on association and backward-looking measure, which proved to be wrong during the financial crisis. So the question at the time that was answered in the book is, can we do something better? Can we have a causal approach, causal thinking, instead of relying potentially on spurious correlation, the correlations derived purely from historical data? And our paper contributes to that line of thinking. But let me give you an example of a scenario. Back in 2014, I was commissioned by an asset managers to think about what would happen if Scotland went out from the UK. And there was a referendum back in 2014. And I had an economist. I started from a narrative. Of course, we're not going to analyze now the detailed narrative, but I'll read some sentences to show how the reasoning was flowing and how we translated this in a Bayesian net. So, for example, at the time, we thought that Scotland would have taken 50% of the oil reserves, 25% of the common debt it shared with England, and it will have to establish its own currency. Had it exited the UK, of course, it was not certain they would have adopted the British pound. It will have to establish new regulators, and because the Scottish government will be weaker, we expect a lot of deposits to leave Scotland from England. We think that the cost of funding in Scotland will be driven largely by the oil price, the share of oil reserves they take, and the debt they assume, and so on, so on. So this was a lengthy narrative. I published it as a chapter in my book on probabilistic graphical models. It's around 30 pages narrative of different paths in the future, how this event would have unfolded in our view. And all this lengthy narrative after 30 pages and 20 days was condensed in a causal graph. So the simple graph you see here is the result of 20 days of work. Without analyzing in detail the nodes, you can see some dark yellow nodes at the bottom. These were the asset classes of interest to the asset managers. So we can see credit spreads, we see interest rates exposure, inflation exposure, and so on. And ultimately, in order to preserve the wealth they were managing, they were interested how this scenario would have impacted those asset classes. Luckily, Scotland didn't go out from the UK at the time, so this scenario did not materialize, but was very useful also to foster discussion and thinking in that asset manager. What you can see here are different nodes, and some of them are macroeconomic variables, some of them are purely political variables. So top left, you can see oil prices. Okay, so we had a model about oil prices and different probabilities that of how oil price would have changed. Of course, the UK and Scotland are price takers, so they cannot impact globally the oil price. So we took some global models of oil pricing. And of course, oil prices feed in the oil reserve income of Scotland because the budget is a very large part driven by oil prices. So this was simple elasticity econometric model. And of course, oil reserve income feeds in the GDP of Scotland, in the external position, in the fiscal position of the country. So these are all macro variables, some of which we had like abundant historical data. We could calculate sensitivities. But other variables, you look at the top, you see two variables, one called oil reserve, the other debt share. So one of the questions is at the time, how would oil be divided? And oil is in the North Sea. Would it have been divided based on geographical principle, on GDP principle, on population principle? There were different narratives being discussed at the time, and we populate that not with different probabilities according also to previous court judgment in similar cases in the world. So you can see an assembly of variables. And I said, it take a long time. And I'm not a UK economist, so I had to hire a person who is really understands this. And of course, whatever the scenario, wherever in the world this scenario, it's relevant for, you need different types of skills and economists and so on. Briefly, I'll show another scenario. This is purely geopolitical. There is not much macroeconomics here. Again, you see the exposure of an asset manager based in the UK to different assets like equities, inflation rates, credit spreads, and also real estate. This is a very actual scenario. It's about strike by Iran on Israel and the potential response of Israel through different transmission channels. So we built this scenario in 2011, so 13 years ago. But what I want to show here that essentially the transmission channels have been stable over the last 13 years. And the way that one of the countries can respond are the same. So the geopolitical configuration in the region has not changed much. Hasn't changed much. This is to substantiate one of the points I made about the robustness of basin networks. If we use correlations to measure some of these things, of course, they're not the fundamental building block of what could move the assets at the bottom for the asset manager. So this scenario, although it is still very actual in the current world. So what are the problems? Of course, basin nets, as I showed, they're very good tools to condense complex economic narratives. They convey a visual language because the whole narrative condensed from 30 pages in a graph is more easy to communicate, especially to the senior management. They can provide an input, inspect the different links, give their own opinion. So basin networks, they make scenarios social. So it can be socialized and shared also with not experts. But what is the problem? So what are some potential problems? And this applies not just to basin nets for scenario analysis, but in general, when building probabilistic causal models, we face the first problem is which variables to include in the basin net. So for example, in the scenario analysis example, two economists could disagree on the drivers in the transmission channels. If you want to use graphical models to model networks or time series, again, you're facing a problem that you have to determine your universe of variables. Have you included all the confounders in the problem? Are there any omitted variables? Are they observable? If they're not, can you find proxies? So which variables to select? It's a problem that causal models face in general, but in this specific context is how to model the relationships in the economy. So the skeleton of the basin network is a second source of uncertainty. So even if we have instantiated, let's say, all the variables, how to connect them? What is the direction of the causal arrow? Especially also in observational studies, there are a lot of algorithms nowadays to train basin nets automatically on data. But there is something called observational equivalence. There can be many solutions to deriving from the same data sets, and many popular algorithms like the PC algorithm that's used for automatic training of this model sometimes returns unoriented edges, and the expert has to give the orientation of the edge. So there is always some level of expertise that needs to be injected in order to finalize the graph. And then what data to use to infer the parameters of the Bayesian nets. If we use, let's say, Bayesian networks for time series analysis, here we use 10 years of sample, 5 years, 7 years and a half. So this has to be justified very often based on economic principles. When it comes to finance, things become even more dynamic because although some of the transmission channels and mechanisms are stable, finance is a very dynamic environment where new events can pop on the radar every day, and they can disappear every day. So it's a very dynamic problem, and having to liaise with many economists, it creates logistic hassle. So in one of my previous employers, we tried to simulate, to create a lab where different experts could interact and create these kind of scenarios, but it was very difficult to get the time of all the experts. The experts are very expensive, and what we notice is a very nice experiment in the room is usually the scenario was drifting towards the person who is more senior, because the more junior economists didn't want to offend the most senior guy. So in the end, the scenario was expressing the view of one person, that the most senior person. So these are all challenges, and building scenarios like this is, there can be some ambiguity, but it's also very, very costly. So the logistics behind having a scenario factory, even if this could be the right approach because it models causal relationship as opposed to pure correlation, there are many hurdles on the path. So what can be a potential solution to some of this problem? So I was thinking at the time, what if we can have access to a multitude of experts from different domains on demand instantaneously? So what we have, let's say, thousands of experts, and we can query them different questions as their opinion on the orientation of edges. Okay, so can we use a wisdom of the crowds approach, convey thousands of experts in the same room virtually to build these scenarios? Can we reduce the time of generating these scenarios from several days, as I mentioned with regards to the Scottish scenario, to a matter of minutes? So source the information almost instantaneously. Can we reduce substantially the cost of doing so? Because, as I mentioned, economists are expensive. If you do this in an automatic way, of course, you have to access the web, buy access, internet access, different things, purchase external data sets. But is the cost much lower? Can we do it at a much lower cost? That's a problem. And can we make this process very time sensitive? So whenever there is something new popping in, incorporating it to the network almost instantaneous, instead of waiting several days for the experts to agree what should be the exact position of this variable. So these were ideas and open questions I had at the time, and luckily I met Olav, who is the other quote of the paper, and we started discussing how to solve this question, and they had come already with a solution with a platform that can help with this. And I would hand over to Olav, who will explain how the whole process of automation and information access works, and how we can build out of this multitude of experts in the web a coherent Bayesian net. To you, Olav.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Olav Laudy. I'm the Chief Data Scientist of Causality Link. In this slide, I will explain the platform that provided the data we used for this research. Causality Link is a fintech platform that parses financial documents. We currently have an archive of over 150 million documents that get translated from 27 languages from over 8,000 sources. It's important to understand that these documents are mostly subscription-level content, and we do not scrape the web or Twitter. On the left top, you see an example of such an article, and I highlighted a single sentence to show what content we extract. Of course, we extract all basic entities like companies and KPIs. Yet our object model also resolves that the KPI production is in fact Ford's production, and the demand is Ford's demand. More importantly, we extract causal relationships. In this sentence, you see a causal relationship expressed, namely, the company wants to increase production to meet growing demand. Just to make a clear distinction, in causal inference, one usually takes some data, computes a relationship, and then, given some conditions, concludes that this is a true causal relation. What we're doing here is very different. You can understand our process as mining the intelligence of the authors who express a causal idea. We detect a driver, Ford demand, and a target, Ford production, and store this as a structured record. This is done for any financial and economical entity thinkable, and has resulted in a data table with 65 million of such causal pairs. The main message of this slide is that we use a fintech platform that collects, among many other things, causal relationships from text. In this slide, I will explain how we get from the individual causal statements to a causal graph and subsequently a direct acyclic graph that forms the basis of our Bayesian networks. The general form of a causal relationship is a driver impacting a target. From the structured records, we can aggregate and count these pairs. Note that this sounds a lot easier than in practice turns out to be the case. For example, if you read on the right the sentence, wholesale inflation fell driven by lower gasoline prices, first of all, you see that the driver gasoline prices is mentioned after the target and of course needs to be understood as the driver impacting the target inflation rate. Moreover, we need to derive from the context that this is the USA inflation rate. The other thing is we utilize a very powerful ontology-driven generalization system that understands gasoline prices as the oil price and economic activity as GDP. And once more, of course, co-references which country's GDP this is. Now, to get an idea, if we're asking what are the top 3 most mentioned drivers for the USA inflation rate, and no, this is data from 2021, we get oil price, food product prices, and USA GDP as answer, with counts in the thousands of statements. We can also ask for all the relations between those 4 nodes, and it may well be that inflation rate is mentioned quite often as driver for food prices. And thus, it is not directly the case that querying something from this database automatically results in a direct acyclic graph. This is where we deploy a small procedure that guarantees the creation of a DAG. First, for a given target or targets, we query the top n most mentioned drivers for each target. Separately, we collect all the links between all the nodes, that is, all the drivers and all the targets together. To create the DAG, we start with a graph only with nodes and populate links in descending order of frequency. If we encounter a link that creates a cycle in the graph, we skip that link. So if you look in the graph on the right, you see that the most mentioned link goes from food product prices to USA inflation rate and not the reverse. Concluding here, the message from this slide is we start with structured records in a database in the form of driver-target pairs, and through a small heuristic, we end up with a direct acyclic graph. In the next 2 slides, I will discuss how we go from a direct acyclic graph to a fully populated Bayesian network. In this slide, I will discuss the input data. The creation of a DAG from text is something that has been done before. What I'm about to explain now, as far as we are aware, has never been done before. It starts with the observation or assumption that I write in bold here. Authors express their observations of recent causal relationships, even if counterintuitive. What do I mean by that? Well, an author can, for example, write, the inflation fell 0.2% driven by lower gasoline prices. So we can see that the oil price was down, and as a result, the inflation rate comes down. We understand this is normal because the oil price has a positive relationship with inflation. However, we see authors also explain negative relations where we expect the reverse. And typically they use the word as despite to express their surprise about this apparent contradiction. For example, in the second sentence, we see an inflation slowdown despite the spike in gasoline prices. So the oil went up, and at the same time, they saw the inflation coming down. Drivers up or down and targets up or down creates 4 possibilities, and we count how often each of those combinations occur. On the bottom, we see such a table, and obviously you see how the diagonal is more populated than the off-diagonal entries. However, the off-diagonal entries still receive quite some weight. If we were to collect this data at a later moment, you would get a slightly different ratio based on what authors believe is the current state of the relationship between oil and inflation. We normalize these counts to probabilities. This is what we refer to as the observed table for the causal pair, and this forms the input of the Bayesian network. So the message on this slide is how we went from counting trends in causal sentences to a table that forms the input of a Bayesian network. In this slide, I'll try to explain how we use multiple of those observed tables for causal pairs and generate a valid joint probability table for a Bayesian network from this. In the paper, we describe this in detail. The simplest way to understand this is we deploy a minimization procedure that takes the observed data and minimizes the incoherence between those tables while estimating parameters of a valid Bayesian network. If we see the small graph, we observe there are 3 causes and a single target. In that case, we would from text receive 3 observed tables of causal pairs, namely cause 1 and a target, cause 2 and a target, cause 3 and a target. We can now write down the joint probability table as it factors into 3 independent root nodes and 1 conditional probability table, conditioning on C1, C2, and C3. It is not trivial how you go from these 3 observed tables to that Bayesian network. We have found a way that computes the most conservative Bayesian network given this input data. Note that in the conditional term of the Bayesian networks, the terms C1, C2, and C3 have more freedom than can be derived from the observed data. The minimization procedure ensures that we return a valid Bayesian network while staying as true as possible to the observed data. I understand that this might be hard to follow from a slide only, and we refer you to the paper for all the details, and I'm most happy to answer questions on this minimization procedure if people are interested. So the message on this slide is how we start with multiple tables of observed causal pairs and derive a valid Bayesian network from this by deploying a minimization procedure that can be understood as minimizing the incoherence between the sources of information. In this slide, I will show how we get a forward-looking Bayesian network. In the previous slide, we ended up with a valid Bayesian network where the relationships were estimated based on recent observations of causality by authors. We will now show how we can supply the root nodes of this Bayesian network with forecasted values, also obtained from text, and compute the new state of the joint probability table using these forecasts. We once more turn our attention to the texts and their extractions obtained from the data platform. This platform is capable not only of identifying the trends of an economic entity, but also classify if it's a past or a future statement. In the top quote, we see how output is understood as oil production, and planned refers to the future. This statement was made on February 8, 2022, and we can derive from this statement that the validity of this forecast ends March 1. This is fully extracted automatically. In the second statement, we see how an author expresses the decline production over a much larger time span. Now, we collect all these future statements from text and compute the forecast signal as the percentage of future statements that point upwards. Note that if we were to compute the collective forecast on March 2, then the first statement would no longer be considered because it's no longer a forecast on March 2. As such, we only consider the not yet realized forecasts. We automatically compute these probabilities for all the root nodes in the graph and subsequently multiply those through to get an updated joint probability table. This updated joint probability table gives us a future state of the world based on recent causal information, updated with collective outlook values. So the message of this slide is how we use the prior obtained Bayesian network and create a future state of the world by inserting the collective forecasts into the root nodes. In this slide, we will discuss two toy examples to demonstrate the interpretation of the resulting graphs, which is a little bit different from the usual Bayesian network displays. We are here modeling three target nodes simultaneously: the gold price, the oil price, and the USA inflation rate. On the result on the left, we have asked for each of those nodes to give us the single most important driver. As you can recall, the procedure to generate a DAG is for all the nodes in the graph to obtain all relationships between them and populate the graph for as long as they don't create cycles. On the left, we stopped at 9 links. This is a choice, and we will come back to that choice. The nodes show percentages, and these are the marginal probabilities computed from the joint probability table. In case a node is a root node, such as DXY, the strength of the US dollar, the percentage is the value of the collective forecast, as explained in the previous slide. Furthermore, you see green and red arrows. Green arrows indicate a positive relationship, and red indicates a negative relationship. The strength of the relationship is both shown in the thickness of the arrow as well as the intensity of the color. When we produced our first graphs, we had numerous economists and financial experts look at these graphs to validate if the direction of the arrows and the direction of the relationships would make sense. And generally, they do. We see how the oil price increases the inflation rate. The inflation rate increases the gold price. The oil production decreases the oil price. And maybe surprisingly a little bit, the oil production increases the inflation rate. Note that if any of those links is unexpected, you're always able to individually inspect the underlying statement that gave rise to this link and decide if potentially some text was taken out of context. On the right, you see what happens if we allow more drivers per target node and more links. You get a different graph, while, as we show in the next slide, the marginal probabilities converge rather quickly. And as you can see, for the target nodes are not too different between the two graphs. So what you should remember from this slide is the way we depict the resulting Bayesian networks with marginal probabilities and positive and negative relationships. In this slide, I will argue that the resulting Bayesian networks are rather stable, as can be seen from two sensitivity analyses. We've already discussed how we can add links to the graph as long as they are discovered in text and they do not violate the DAG constraint. At a certain moment, you may get a graph that is rather dense, and the last added links may not be that frequently discussed. Somehow, we may have to decide on a number of links to add to the graph. To investigate this, we fit a Bayesian networks with the same number of nodes, but we keep adding links, and we see that the joint probabilities of the target nodes with increasing number of links do not change that much anymore. Another analysis
I would like to remind the speakers to have to finish up in about 5 minutes, please.
I'm
Okay.
sorry, I need 10 more minutes.
I couldn't find that on Apple Music.
Okay, well, we'll just let's see where you end up with. Go ahead.
I will most certainly end in time, but I need 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Another analysis that we can do is keep adding more drivers per target node, and that is shown in the right table. We go from 1 driver per target node to a maximum of 5 drivers per target node. The latter resulting in a rather large Bayesian network with 18 nodes and thus 2 to the power 18 states. We also observe that adding more drivers does not seem to change the joint probability of the target nodes very much with increasing number of drivers. So we conclude here too that the model stabilizes rather quickly. Thus, the takeaway from this slide is we conducted 2 sensitivity analyses, and they both showed that the model with reasonably low number of links and low number of drivers already provide fairly stable estimates. In this slide, we see 2 Bayesian networks fit on different dates. The first fit on January 1, 2021 was a time when Trump was still president. On April 1, the graph on the right, Biden was president. We see interesting changes in the graph. If we focus on the lower part of the graph, when Trump was president, we see how the USA GDP was moderately growing, which was believed to push up taxes. The macro consumer conditions was with 55% nearly neutral and thus not pushing up the US GDP much. When Biden came to power, we see how the estimate for the macro consumer conditions rises to 69%, which subsequently pushes up the forecast of the GDP to 77%. Interestingly, we observe how the arrow between US GDP and taxes is reversed. During the Trump administration, people believed that the GDP would provide taxes. However, during the start of the Biden administration, authors were much more writing about the increasing taxes having a negative impact on the GDP. Yet, despite this negative link, the positive macro consumer conditions still forecasted an increasing GDP. We also see in the left graph how under Trump, the oil prices were relatively stable with 52%, whereas under Biden, the oil prices were forecasted to go up, driven mainly by a strong demand. The higher oil prices in turn were predicted to push up inflation, eventually leading to higher interest rates. Note that the creation of these Bayesian networks is fully automatic, and this was done only based on the information extracted from text, followed by the minimization procedure as explained. The basis of this must have been thousands of documents with possibly hundreds of thousands of underlying statements. We have not encountered anything in literature that was able to do the same. You can argue that it looks reasonable, but how do I know that this is actually true? We will discuss that in the next slide. However, the message of this slide is that with this method, it is possible to generate rather interesting macroeconomic Bayesian networks, monitor them over time, and quickly understand leading narratives and regime changes. In this slide, we will demonstrate how the daily computation of a Bayesian network that results in a single marginal probability that the oil price will go up can be used to trade oil rather successfully. Note that we're not arguing here that this is a complete trading strategy. However, we aim to demonstrate that integrating drivers and computing a Bayesian network generates some alpha that apparently was still available in the market. We're building 2 Bayesian networks. The first is an 8-driver model for the oil demand, and we plug in this oil demand estimate in a second Bayesian network, once more with 8 drivers with the target oil price. There are some more subtleties to this model, which we have documented in a paper specifically about trading oil, which I'm happy to share with anyone interested. Before we look at the results, I want to mention two things. First is we have been running this model since 2022 and have not updated any of the model generation parameters, such as the maximum number of links. This clearly is an attempt to not overfit even the slightest bit. The second thing is I want to emphasize that this is a fully unsupervised model. The simplest way maybe to understand it is it's a normalization of text that integrates the forecasts of the drivers of the oil price into a probability that the oil price will increase in the future. So at no point in time we have used the actual oil price and tuned some parameters such that the model would fit the oil price the best as possible. We compute this Bayesian network every day, and then based on the prior day result, we paper trade the day after. The trading rules are rather simplistic. If the probability that the oil price will go up is larger than 0.6, we go long. If it drops below 0.55, we exit the long, and we have a symmetrical method for the shorts. Over the last 4 years, this has resulted in an IRR of 76% and a Sharpe ratio of 1.72, which is rather good compared to a long-only result. We see in the graph on the bottom the blue line, which is the daily Bayesian network probability, and the gray dotted line, which is the actual oil price. The colored areas indicate if we were long in green, short in red, and white not in the market. Around February 2020, the model probability violently went down. This was due to the lower oil demand related to COVID. This is where a large part of the profitability of the model comes from. I also want to point out a more recent example, namely around September 2023, where you see that after a mixed period of being in and out of the market, we suddenly go short. At this time, Goldman Sachs had an adamant forecast that the oil price would rise up to $100 a barrel, something that did not manifest, in our understanding, again due to demand weakness. So the message of this slide is, while we're not aiming to provide a complete trading mechanism to make money on oil, we believe that these results demonstrate the potential value that can be derived from such a collective intelligence methodology in the investment space. In this slide, I will try to argue why the method works. Our main understanding is that such an approach frees you from tunnel vision. All different opinions, contrarian or not, are weighted into the forecast, both the causal relationships as well as into the forecasts for the drivers. Another interesting aspect is the automatic incorporation of new drivers. As we compute the network every day, we ask the data collection system to provide the most mentioned drivers for the target. If a driver suddenly gets a lot of media attention, it might suddenly show up as a driver where another driver drops out. You see this illustrated in the graph on this slide. I encircled a particular date, namely February 17th, where the driver's oil futures was replaced by the driver oil export activity. In retrospect, this was very accurate, as the Ukraine-Russia war was brewing and many authors discussed the potential impact of the future Russian export activity on oil prices. Furthermore, another reason that we can point at why this method works is the fact that all incoherent or contrarian information from financial documents is smoothened into a coherent probabilistic framework. Finally, this model, as mentioned in the previous slide, is fully unsupervised. This means it's less susceptible to overfitting. Thus, the main message in this slide is we believe that this Bayesian network approach works because it fairly incorporates all the data available into a valid probabilistic framework. As we reach the conclusion of this presentation, I would like to highlight what we have accomplished. We have demonstrated the capability to create Bayesian networks entirely from text, a novel approach not previously documented in literature. This technique serves as a powerful tool for automatically synthesizing expert opinions into Bayesian networks quickly and efficiently. Our work was conducted in 2021, well in advance of the widespread recognition of collective intelligence, today embodied as generative AI. However, it's important to note that despite Gen AI's advancements, the ability to accurately count occurrences and reference source material in text remains a challenge, while our method effectively addresses this. In addition, the Bayesian networks are a welcome, transparent reasoning tool, contrasted with the black box that is Gen AI. Looking to the future, we are interested in exploring the sensitivity of our models to changes in the input document corpus. Our simulations indicate that our models are remarkably stable, even with variations in the input data. However, the quality of the input data is crucial. When financial media misses causal explanations, one can understand that this directly impacts the quality of the models. We are keen to collaborate on projects where we can access a broader range of high-quality internal research, which we believe could further refine our results. Additionally, we plan to explore how our Bayesian network methodology can be integrated with other analytical techniques that utilize structured data. Thank you for your attention. Alex and I are now open to any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Olav, and thank you, Alex. And I'd like to open it for questions. And Ricardo Herbonato had his hand up for quite a while. Go ahead, Ricardo.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the very interesting presentation. Something that struck me, I have worked with Bayesian nets, as Alexander was saying at the beginning, in financial institutions. It was done in a very different way. It was with subjective inputs to the joint probability tables, and the value there was by saying portfolio managers were giving their subjective probabilities, looking at consequences, and then there was a soul-searching exercise of saying, this doesn't make sense, where did we go wrong? So it was a very it was the opposite of an automatic process. What you're proposing here is basically a forecast tool, which is completely different. At that point, I find it strange that first of all, you can't calculate a Sharpe, you can calculate it, but it's meaningless to do a Sharpe ratio over 2, 3, or 4 years. You need 20 years for a Sharpe ratio. You got a delta t in the numerator or the square root of delta t in the denominator. Perhaps, given the short period of time, you could have looked at tens of thousands or 1,000 predictions and then show me a distribution of the Sharpe ratios. But I would have pitted it against any of the other traditional methods, multi-var methods, etc., not to a long only, which looks a tiny bit an unfair horse race. And at that point, given your limited amount of time, so you're moving away from a cognitive tool into a prediction tool. For this prediction tool, you're showing me 1 point of a Sharpe ratio calculated over 4 years. I don't find that convincing. I would need thousands of predictions, and then I can make a distribution where you win and when you lose, and then I say, oh yeah, perhaps there is something. And I would like a horse race, not against long only, but against the best possible alternatives.
Yeah, if you
for that comment, okay. May I respond to that?
Maybe I respond to the first part, Olav, about the scenario analysis, what Ricardo mentioned about the approach he's taken, and I fully agree. So we're against black boxes and some magic tool that you press the button, you get something. It should be always a consequence of challenging, reasoning, querying, correcting, going back to the drawing board. So the tool that we just showed here collects different experts' opinions. So all demand will increase inflation, all demand will decrease. So it collects different causal statements and calculates the relative frequency, create joint probability tables. So all these statements are visible. But instead of having one expert saying, okay, all price demand will drive inflation up, we have hundreds of different authors expressing how would oil demand will impact inflation. And their knowledge is collected in this frequency table. So this is a frequency count of different opinions, and this is how the probabilities are derived. If 60% of the people will say oil demand will drive inflation up, 40% the opposite, we put 60-40 in the table. We don't put, but it's automatic. So this is a tool to collect different statements, and of course, is Olav showed in the Bayesian networks, you get something sensible, but you don't blindly trust it. But you have a platform that aggregated thousands of opinions for you. You can always challenge, you can always modify the arrows, modify the probability tables, and so on. But you start from somewhere. For me, who I'm not an expert now, what would happen now if Trump wins the next elections? I have no idea where to start from. I don't have that expertise. This tool is a very good initial step to collect everything for the web and to present a causal story. And of course, I can challenge, speak to US economists and can modify. With the trading rule, it's just, we presented the paper. The trading rule is not the main results of the paper. It's the last section of the paper. We are required by the referee to put something on trading. So this is why we put it. But the main achievement of the paper is not some trading or strategy, but it's how to populate this Bayesian network by achieving scale, by acquiring different economists. Olav, sorry, I interrupted you.
No worries. I think that's a sufficient answer to me, and I indeed want to reiterate that it was not the main result to trade. However, if you generate a scenario and
no, I understand. Sorry to interrupt. It's not the main result to trade, but ultimately you're producing now a prediction tool. And a way to test a prediction is only to do a proper test of a prediction, because it's no longer a cognitive tool. By creating all this very nice and very interesting thing, you say it is effectively a black box. I have to trust that when I press the button, in a few minutes, it will collect the information and it comes up with this prediction. Now, the question is prediction right or wrong? It's no longer what it used to be, which could be right or wrong, a cognitive tool for people to challenge their own understanding and say, I've seen portfolio managers say, oh, I thought this, but this doesn't make sense. The painful nature of the exercise was one of the pluses. And that's what many portfolio managers liked. It was even used at investment committee level, when people would spend a considerable amount of time debating and et cetera, et cetera. You produce now a prediction tool. And the way to test a prediction tool, whether you trade or not, is to do a good test of whether it predicts well.
Okay, point taken.
Okay, let's leave it at that, because there's still a long list of questions, and I'd like to ask Guido Imbens next.
Thanks, Horst. So I have two questions. Actually, I have a bunch of questions, but let me limit it to two. I think this is a very interesting paper, very interesting set of questions. One is the cyclicality. You rule that out kind of sequentially by including the first path that is mentioned the most often, and then ruling out the opposite path that may also be mentioned. But in many economic settings, we're very interested in feedback mechanisms, kind of between monetary policy and causal links go both ways. Kind of the same, sort of a classic biological example is if you look at time series on the number of predators and number of wolves, and you look at time series on the number of prey, say elk, there's a causal effect of the number of wolves on the number of elk, but there's also a causal effect of the number of elk on the number of wolves. And your models seem to rule that out by not having a very explicit time series structure. The second question, and let me ask the second question as well, and then you can answer kind of both or defer some of them. In economics, often expectations matter. And so it need not be that a particular statement that you use in your data says there's an effect of oil prices on inflation, but it's more that the Federal Reserve may make statements on what they view the state, where that statement itself has an effect on economic activity, on prices, on inflation. And so I didn't see how that type of statement would play a role in your model, because it seemed like all the variables you were trying to put in there were real variables rather than policy positions.
Let me take the first question, the part of the question. All of you might want to take the same. So this, you're right that this is not a way of modeling that exhaustive of all the things that can appear in economics, in finance. You're right, there are a lot of cycles, and there are other graphical models, and I've done quite a lot of research that are able to accommodate cyclic relationship and direct relationship, like Markov networks, chain graphs that accommodate direct causal relationship, and also cross-section of contemporaneous. So, for example, GDP and unemployment, they're inversely related, but which causes which? It's a feedback loop in the end. It also depends how you time slice your time series. At a certain level of aggregation, you can have feedback loop, but if you disentangle with a fine-grained scale, you can get the causal effects. But there are many things in phenomena like cycles, time scales that are present in economics, of course, but by no means we present the final model of economics, but essentially what is the causal story of the day given asset classes of interest. What are the most discussions, what is the most frequent discussions around cause and effect that can be at play with the asset classes of interest? So if you want, you're interested in Tesla, you know that the Taiwan earthquake influenced the chip production, influenced the stock of Tesla. All these relationships are very difficult for the analyst to solve, but this gives you a simplified causal story of the moment. Okay, you can see the drivers that drive your stock of interest, for example, and you can, to the point of Ricardo, you can question them, you can query them, you can discuss them internally with your analyst, but automatically conveys what's the causal story, which by no means is the full story. And with regards to expectations, this can be incorporated as well. It's not just hard nodes of fixed macroeconomic variables, inflation, growth, but Olav can comment more on the ontology of the nodes.
Yeah, I think in the larger graph that we showed, you see a number of those more not direct variables displayed, and for example, interest rate. And if you were to feed the interest rate with expectations, people say, well, we believe the interest rate will go up or will go down. And so that in effect is averaged and taken into account. But at the same time, it depends on indeed the most mentioned drivers for the phenomenon that you're modeling. And if the most mentioned drivers come back for oil price simply as production, demand, and inventory, then that is what the at least the literature or the financial media suggests. And of course, nothing would prevent you from taking that as a starting point and and take your advantage with that, and then add your own flavor to the model by saying, well, I believe that there's something else that should be included in the model. And even you could add that note to the model yourself and then again go back to the data source and ask, well, if I were to put this node in the model, what would be the population of the probabilities?
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to move on. Miguel Hernan is next. Miguel.
Thank you, Horst. So a quick comment and 2 questions. The quick comment is about the cycles. The cycles are, of course, a very important part of the causal story. And in the health sciences, people have been using causal network with feedback for a long time. The way that is done is by showing not cycles, because you cannot have that in directed acyclic graph, you will lose all the mathematical properties of a graph, as you know, but you can expand in time each of the variables, and that is how it's done every day. You have a new medication that affects blood pressure, and the blood pressure level affects whether you take the medication in the future. So now you have one node per medication per day or per month, and one node per blood pressure per day or per month. So this is standard practice. And I also saw, I was also very surprised that cycles were not included here. But my question is really, I'd like you to help me a little bit understand what the goal is here, because I am a little bit confused. One possible goal is to produce a summary of what is believed, and you give different weights to different beliefs, and then you express that in a directed acyclic graph with a DAG. Another different goal is to use this as a tool for causal inference. And the name of the company seems to go into that direction. So the thing is that you can clearly express beliefs in a DAG, but a DAG doesn't have to be a causal DAG. A DAG is just a compact way of encoding a joint distribution, as you have shown beautifully here, but that doesn't mean that it is a causal DAG that can be used for causal inference. A causal DAG has to meet additional conditions, like the Markov condition, essentially that all common causes of two nodes on the DAG have to be also included on the DAG. And it doesn't seem that that the method that you are proposing can find out all the common causes of each pair of nodes. So help me out here. What's really the goal here? Are you saying that this can be used for causal inference in case that we have data on all these nodes, or is mostly a summary, a synthesis of opinions, but not necessarily geared towards causal inference with data? That's one question.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Let me ask my second question very quickly, so you can also do that. My second question is more practical. I read the paper, and the paper describes, the paper talks about data and talks about methods, but it's unclear to me how much of what is described in the paper would allow readers to evaluate the method, because a lot of these things seem to be proprietary. There's no code. So what would readers need to evaluate the methods that are outlined in the paper? Thank you.
Yeah, let me take that. Yeah, to your cycle questions, yeah, we don't deny that cycles are important to model, and maybe this is the next step in the research. With this paper, by no means we solved all the problems and eventualities that that can appear, and also in finance, you know, the causal relationship that can change abruptly in time. Does money cause prices? Do prices cause money? That's an eternal question. It depends on the country, on the time period, and people have spent a lot of, you know, papers and research to argue both ways. So things can shift quite rapidly in financial markets. Its causality is rarely preserved forever. So this gives you an idea of what a snapshot of what is driving your assets of interest. And to the example in the paper, if you're an asset manager with exposure to gold, US inflation, and oil, and you have to allocate wealth between these three different assets, is you reach something called the joint probability table. What are the different configurations of the world? What is the probability that oil is up, gold is up, inflation is down? So you have the joint occurrence table, which in the case of three assets, you have 8 possible states of the world. You know, oil up, 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 up. So if you, this is a joint probability table, and of course you need joint probability table if you want to do portfolio optimization and you have multi-assets. Even in a standard Markowitz approach, you have correlation matrix between the different assets, how they co-move, and you can do allocation based on correlation matrix. Here we give you a correlation matrix, a joint probability table based on a causal story. It's not that we took oil prices from the past, gold prices from the past 10 years, calculated a joint probability table, we put it in a Markowitz optimization engine. No, it's derived from causal statements and for drivers. So there are many joint causes that drive gold, for example. As you grow the tree from these assets, you can see joint common causes that drives, let's say gold and inflation together. If inflation is up, also gold appreciate. So you can understand the different combinations of occurrences of these assets being up and down, and you can do your diversification argument. So this is the practical aspect. What is going to be the future states of the universe with different probabilities, and instead of relying on past data, build it with forward-looking data from the web, which of course, as you say, it's imperfect. We cut corners, we don't have cycles. Sometimes if a link is very weak, we just cut the link, we cut corners. By no means it's perfect, but all the networks we have inspected, they make economic sense. And again, as Ricardo mentions, there's always the expert that has to validate. It's not purely automatic black box things, because what is returned is visible. You have a graph, you don't have a ChatGPT kind of thing. You don't know how it generated. You see what's been generated, you can query and you can modify it. But the final aim is to have the future state of the universe. And Olav, if you want to take the other part.
Yeah, so I think the first objective of Causality Link was to mine the untapped causal statements that people issue in financial media. And we believe that there's a wealth of information. People can say, well, I believe that the gold price will be up, but that is that is a statement that very quickly loses its recency, right? Because if that statement is a month old, it's no longer valid. Whereas people explain how the world works, that supposedly is much longer. And that's kind of like also shown by Alex with this Israel-Iran example. That was from 13 years ago, and that still stands. So we believe in the value and also in slightly longer term of causal relationships. They were not yet, and no one was able to capture that effectively from financial media in our understanding. And then getting indeed into the second question, the paper does provide an input table for one of the models where if you were to apply the code to that table, you are able to rerun the network. But indeed, the data generation procedure is proprietary because no one else has attempted to create causal statements extracted from financial media. Having said that, I also welcome any collaboration, right? So I'd be most happy to share data around causal statements made and see where we can lead this model to.
So I have one last question from Marcos Lopez de Prado, who is a member of the review committee. And then I would like to wrap this up, and with apologies to those of you who raised their hand and are no longer getting a turn. Marcos.
Thank you, Horst. And I would like to commend the authors of this paper. I think that they have made a truly novel and remarkable contribution to that sets them apart compared to many other papers in the literature. The way I understand the main objective of your paper is to try to derive causal theories. So it's not so much that this is a causal discovery tool. This is not really about looking into some associations that are present in some observations, and derive a causal graph from that. That's not the objective. The objective is, this is the causal graph that is associated with what is written in the literature. So I think that it is very useful in order to represent, visualize what are the causal explanations in people's minds. And again, this may or may not be connected to the actual data generating process. But that's what is making this paper special. It makes it special because in economics, as Professor Imbens already explained, expectations are very important. And one way of assessing expectations is to derive the causal theories that are in people's minds. So this is the preamble of my question. My question is, it's very common in economic discourse to read statements that need to be put within a framework. So one may read a statement that is written by someone who has a new Keynesian framework in mind, and another author will make a related statement that has in mind a neoclassical framework. Now, the approach that you have developed visualizes a consensus or some sort of common observation. But that may create a situation where the graph is really a mix of statements from different schools. So I was thinking, have you thought about a way of somehow polarizing these graphs, identifying based on a body of literature, what are the separated types of causal graphs? Meaning that finding some sort of combination of graphs in the end would be the equivalent to combining literatures that really operate under different theoretical frameworks. So have you thought about a way of identifying the graphs that can be separated based on the different ideological and theoretical frameworks used by the people writing those texts?
Thank you, and thank you for your kind comment. Yes, we have, and I think first through the fact that we use a very large corpus, it is a little bit difficult to identify the same author, because if you see a single graph, you can have thousands of authors. However, if we were in a situation where you have like a lower number of authors and one author can be identified as doing multiple statements, then I can imagine that you can do a cluster analysis on the similarity between authors on the causal statements, in which case you simply get the separation of two or three groups which all have their own or associated causal graph.
Very good, thank you. Yes, excellent, thank you very much.
Okay, then I unfortunately will have to conclude now this very enlightening discussion and thank the speakers for their presentation. Thank the reviewers for their questions and comments, and also thank our online audience for their participation to make this a truly global competition. So thank you, everybody, and have a good morning, a good rest of the day, or a good night for wherever you are. And I hope you all will join us again next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.